Thank you, everyone. It's a great pleasure and an honor to speak to you for me this evening. I guess it's morning for you. Maria asked me to share about the tree work that I did in Africa. I'd also like to just give a little bit of the background story. It gives a little bit of context, what took me there and how that affected the work that I did. So I grew up in a very beautiful part of Australia. This area was my playground. As children, we climbed the trees and wandered over the hills. We swam and fished in the river. But at that stage in my life, there were three major things that shaped the person that I am to this day. And one was the large-scale destruction of that bushland that I love so much. As a child, I couldn't understand how short-term gain could justify the long-term destruction of the environment that we all depend on for life and for a happy life. The second thing was I was very curious about the world, and I used to read, I used to watch the news, and it struck me that while farmers in my home area grew tobacco, there were children just like me who happened to be born elsewhere, but they were going to bed hungry. And I felt there was great injustice in that. And I was very angry, actually. um, Fortunately, the third influence on my life was my mum, and she had a very strong faith. And I think that gave me a framework for life. There are more important things to life than financial security. And we do have a duty of care for those less fortunate than ourselves, and we have a duty of care for the environment. So there I was, angry, frustrated. I didn't know how to change my world. And I just shut up a child's prayer. Please use me somehow, somewhere to make a difference. And be careful what you wish for. It may well happen. I went on to study agriculture at university, and that's where I met my wife. And we've been in this work all of our careers. And I just wanted to pay tribute to Liz. She's here at home with me, but all these years she's been a wonderful support. She's come up with ideas of her own, and she continues in this field. And we've worked together in very tough conditions and in times when things were going well, but she stuck by my side all these years. So I just wanted to pay tribute to her. We joined an organization that took us to Niger Republic, West Africa. You can see the star there. So landlocked country, to this day, one of the poorest countries in the world. And certainly at the time, suffering from massive deforestation, land degradation, and desertification. I put that picture there. We didn't really live in a mud hut, but when I visited the villages, I'd often stay in people's homes. So there I was, fresh graduate out of university, and lots of theory in my head, but the landscape that confronted me was deeply shocking. What do you do? Even though in my lifetime, and I think we were 24 years old when we arrived, this had been a biodiverse dryland forest with fertile land in the clearings, with springs of plentiful water, even wildlife. In a couple of short decades, it had been reduced to a point of ecological collapse, and it could barely support life, either human or wildlife. So it's a terrible situation for people, and we didn't know so much about climate change in the 1980s. Of course, it was a factor. We now know that the whole of West Africa has experienced around a 25 to 30% step down in average annual rainfall. So that's certainly very significant. But what we did know was as populations grew, there was greater demand for farmland and clearing of that land at a massive scale. Well, environmental destruction has consequences. And what people were experiencing was increased severity and frequency of drought, higher temperatures, reduced soil fertility, And even in the years when we did get rainfall and you would expect a good crop, because there was no biodiversity, there were no checks and balances in the system where you had natural predators of insect pests. In those good years, there'd be an explosion of different kinds of pests that could still decimate people's crops. So life was very, very difficult. People were hungry. Often there was displacement and great poverty. Life was hard for everybody. It was particularly hard for women and children. The labor required just to live increased. Water tables dropped. It became further and further to collect the fuel wood. Harvests were reduced. Life for women and children was very hard, and often it meant the children couldn't go to school because their labor was required, and the parents couldn't afford it anyway. In my mind, if deforestation was one of the major root causes of all these problems, then surely if we put trees back in the landscape, it would go a long way towards reducing those issues. And when you're young, I'm sure many of you can identify with this. You feel invincible. You feel you can solve the problems, the world's problems yesterday, and it simply wasn't happening. I poured all my energy into this. I read the textbooks. I applied the experts with questions. I experimented different methods, different species, different timing. Nothing worked in a sustainable, economically viable way. 80% or more of the seedlings died. And to add insult to injury, the people that I'd come to help, the very people I'd come to help, called me the crazy white farmer. Who in their right mind would waste valuable farmland with trees, of all things, when they're hungry? And the thought in their mind was, maybe my children, maybe my grandchildren would benefit, but I'm hungry today. I can't wait around for a tree to grow. And so there's this great issue, but I empathized with them, but I knew viable agriculture, productive agriculture in this landscape without trees was not possible. They needed the protective cover of trees to reduce the very strong wind speeds, the high temperatures, to increase the soil fertility, and so on. So there was a dilemma. And I guess it was very frustrating. At a number of points I could have easily given up and gone home. But I felt, no, there must be a solution to all this. And it all came to a bit of a head this day. The photo was taken there. And if you look in every direction, north, south, east, west, barely a tree in sight. There I am with a vehicle load of seedlings, knowing full well most would die. The people didn't care anyway. And yet there's this terrible, really an existential threat to the people living there. What to do? And again, it was one of those times in my life when I just threw up a prayer, please help us, open our eyes. And the amazing thing to me is I'd been traveling on this bush track for 2.5 years by this stage, eyes completely open, but totally blind to what's now very, very obvious in that landscape. And on this day, you can see me reducing the air pressure so that the vehicle won't get bogged in the deep sand. And what appeared as a useless bush, used to trample them, used to drive over them, never giving it a thought. On this day, it caught my attention, and I walked over and took a closer look. After this lesson, when you're back outside again and you look at any plant, you look at the shape of the leaf. For most species, it tells you very clearly what species that is. It's like a signature. And as soon as I saw the shape of the leaf, I knew that's not a bush, that's not a weed, it's a tree, and it's been cut down and it's re-sprouting from the stump. And for me, in that moment, everything changed. Because in my 2.5 years there, I knew there were millions of these emerging trees across that landscape. And I realized I'm not fighting climate change or the Sahara Desert. I'm not in need of a multi-million-dollar budget. Everything that I need is literally at my feet. And what's really required is changed behavior. If it was people's behavior that reduced the environment to its knees where it was barely functioning, then surely if we could change those behaviors, nature would have a chance to heal itself. I call those bushes, and it's not just living tree stumps. There are millions and millions of dormant seeds in that landscape, and many of them germinate each year, but because of continuous ploughing, overgrazing, in some cases burning, vast burning, and the collection of woody biomass, because this is people's energy source, and they don't leave anything. They need every piece for cooking, for light, for even keeping warm in a certain part of the year. If you can alter those behaviors, then the environment would have a chance to self-heal. I call it the underground forest because if we had special vision and we could see into the soil, we would quickly realize that when you cut a tree down, for most species, the tree doesn't die, and you have up to 50% of the biomass of the tree buried in the ground. And this is like having a V8 engine, and the motor's switched on, but it's not in gear. It's not free to regrow because we're trampling and cutting and burning and so on. And all we do with the technique that we develop, farmer managed natural regeneration, we remove the constraints and we guide the growth through thinning, through selection and thinning of the excess stems and pruning of some of the side branches. And so this is a photo from a roadside cutting in Tanzania, and you can see the extent of the roots, and that's not the full depth of them. So imagine you cut the top of the tree down, and if this is a species that has the capacity to coppice or re-sprout, look at that volume of roots feeding moisture, nutrients, and stored sugars. The growth rate can be quite amazing, even in a very, very dry environment. And so my whole approach shifted from primarily technical, what species, what method, what timing, to more social. And I believe that if I could regreen mindsets, then because everything that you need is already provided in nature, the rest would be relatively easy. And the method is quite simple. It's not even a new method. It goes back centuries in different regions of the world. You can find examples of this in one form or another. We call it either coppicing if you're regrowing from the stump, or pollarding if you cut up higher and keep managing the growth of the branches. So very simple steps. We find and select the trees that we want to regrow. We prune the excess stems. When you've cut a tree down, often there could be 30 or more stems, all competing for the same resources of light and nutrients and water, even space. So we reduce that excess. And in a sense, it's releasing what's remaining to grow more quickly. We protect the growth from those adverse things, fire, ploughing, cutting, livestock. The tree does the growing. Importantly, when you consider that we're working here with amongst the poorest people in the world, we're not creating, in this example, we're not creating a national park. If the people didn't have the right to utilize what they're regrowing, they simply wouldn't do it unless you continued to pay them. And that's not sustainable. And it's not even doable if you think of the scale of deforestation, the vastness of the need for reforestation. It's not possible to pay everybody to do this. Far better for people to have a direct incentive to manage these trees sustainably. And so I thought, yes, this is it. This is what's going to change things. And I got about 10 farmers in as many villages. And I said, I think this will work. I think it'll make a difference. Would you be willing to try on a small corner of your land? And don't do it on the whole area because people are risk averse. And in case it doesn't work and it's detrimental to your agriculture, we'll just try it in a little area. And you can see here, just after a couple of months from that selection and thinning and pruning, already those useless looking bushes are starting to take form and they're starting to look like small trees. Everything was going fine, but then this is 1983. Events beyond our control took over and there was a terrible drought. Crops failed. People were leaving and suffering severely. And it was a disaster for many people, and it could have been a greater disaster. But we made a decision to not just provide food aid. That would have been good in its own right, but you haven't solved the problem. And the drought would come back again, and there would be hunger again and again and again. We turned that resource, food aid, into a tool for introducing this new approach to managing land and vegetation. We created a Food for Work program, and for those people who wanted to participate, we required them to regenerate 40 trees per hectare, and every month we would check if the trees were there, and then there would be a food allotment. And we did that for the best part of 6 or 7 months. People didn't like it. People were fearful. If those trees grow, they will shade my crop and I'll have less food. Fortunately, in 1984, the rains were excellent. Despite having trees on their land, they had bumper yields, very good crops that year. And a percentage of the people, even without ongoing food aid, they said, Tony's a little bit strange. We don't understand his ideas. It didn't do any harm, though. Let's take this another year and see where it takes us. And that core group, that critical mass of people, maybe 20, 25% of the total population, that was the nucleus for a movement that went on to spread across Niger at the rate of 250,000 hectares per year for 20 years. And after 20 years, there were 200 million trees across 5 million hectares of farmland. You can see on the satellite image the black dots are trees. In the late 1970s, average tree density was less than 4 trees per hectare, and there are many areas with no trees whatsoever. Within just a few years, and without planting a single tree, average tree density increased to around 40 trees per hectare. And farmers themselves created what we call an agroforest parkland. As I said, in this particular case, it's not a national park. People have to live, have to eat. And so they're growing crops and raising livestock under the protective cover of the trees. And in addition, the trees themselves have become a cash crop in their own right, providing fuel wood and building poles and fodder for the livestock, wild foods, traditional medicines, and much, much more. As the people benefited, I was working in a fairly restricted area, 100 villages in one district. News started to spread. Farmers observed what their neighbours were doing. Visitors passing through asked questions. And this became an organic movement out of my control, which I was very, very happy about. Who wants to control a thing like this? I finished up in Niger. We lived there 17 years and came back home to Australia and joined World Vision. And I thought, wonderful, the world's my oyster. World Vision works in 100 countries. All of them are impacted by deforestation to one degree or another. Let me add it. Our first big breakthrough came in Ethiopia. And in this instance, it happens to be a carbon trading project. So as the trees grow, people earn carbon credits. It's not agricultural land, so there's no competition there with food crops. And this community had been food aid dependent for the best part of 20 years, sometimes more, sometimes less. The amazing thing is, when they restored this forest, 2,700 hectares, even in bad years when many other of their countrymen were suffering and needing food aid, these communities were not only self-sufficient, they had a surplus to help others with. And I said, how does that work? This isn't even agricultural land. And it was wonderful. They said, Mr. Tony, in the wet years, when it rained on those bald hills, it used to flow off. And we would get flooding, we would get mudslides, even boulders coming and destroying our crops. And we couldn't grow a crop in that season. And in the dry years, normally in the past, before the forest came back, there would be no fallback for us. There'd be no alternative if our crops failed. We'd have to leave and go to the capital city. But now, because the forest's there, we have fodder, we have wood that we can sell, we have wild harvest, honey, and so on. And in addition, it's changed the microclimate. And they said in a drought year, when those clouds come and hit our mountain, they're more likely to drop their rain on us than on our neighbours. And yes, in a drought year, we get less rain than what we would like. But that rain is so effective because the temperatures are lower, the wind speeds are less, and there's more organic matter binding that moisture to the soil for longer. And so even in a drought year, and even though initially this work was not on agricultural land, people were benefiting. And so I've witnessed this transformation, the rehydration of landscapes, the return of various types of biodiversity, and the improvement in people's livelihoods. And it's been quite a remarkable thing. When you think of Niger and parts of Ethiopia that are so poor, what had been this downward spiral of degradation and poverty and despair, now through this simple thing that's a solution literally at your feet, people growing more and different types of crops and livestock because there's better microclimate, better soil conditions. And that downward spiral's reversed into an upward spiral of restoration, relative prosperity. These are still poor countries, but people are much, much better off. And most important, hope, the restoration of hope. And I never thought, you don't read about hope in development textbooks, but what I've discovered is it's actually one of the most important elements. And I think it's important for us. So many of us are despairing about climate change. It's too late. There's nothing we can do. If you don't have hope, you won't fight it. You just grovel and accept your fate. But if you have hope, you wake up in the morning with a spring in your step. You'll try new things. You'll send your children to school, and you'll do things that hopeless people will not do. So this was a very big lesson to me. And it's been wonderful when I've had the opportunity to revisit some of these communities that have embraced this technique. You can see it written on their faces, this restoration of hope. And if you put yourself in their shoes, what must it be like if you're a parent? You can't feed or clothe or even educate your children. I think it's soul destroying. I think as a parent, I would feel like a failure. And here's this simple thing, working with nature instead of hammering it, instead of destroying it. It empowers you, it enables you to create that future that you want for yourself and your children. So today's topic, Maria gave us some guidelines how we organize together with other species in ways that bring about ecological restoration and restore the health of communities. And restore the health of communities. So if I could just distill a few of the lessons that I've learned over the years. If your assumptions are incorrect at the outset of a venture, you will not attain the optimum result in the most efficient or cost-effective way. You'll spend money on things that aren't the real problem. You'll use techniques that aren't really addressing the issues. Some of the assumptions that were so common when we started were indigenous trees are useless. They grow slowly. They're crooked. They're not millable for timber and so on and so forth. They were written off, and most land restoration projects and tree planting projects utilized exotics, eucalyptus, and so on and so forth. That assumption was wrong. Indigenous trees are very useful. And if you think historically, this was people's pharmacy where they got their medicines, their food chest, their source of their hardware store, and so many other things. And they don't grow slowly, especially when you regrow them from a mature stump. They grow very, very quickly. And with management, with pruning, you can actually guide the growth and get a much better product if that's what you're looking for. Secondly, this long-standing, intractable, most difficult problem of desertification must require massive investment, technological solutions, expertise. No, no. I think our problem is when we think nature is broken, we are the experts and we have to fix it. What I discovered is actually if we remove the constraints that are stopping nature from self-healing, it's very, very capable, even in the most extreme environments. It astounds me how much capacity nature has for self-healing and for springing back. And the third major assumption that was false is that people are the problem, that people have chopped the trees down. We have to control them. We have to lock them out. Again, wrong, wrong, wrong. The people are the solution. And how can we mobilize the energy? If you think about it, the people's very livelihood depends on getting this right. And if we can guide them, if we can open their eyes on how we can have a win-win situation where you work with nature and the environment benefits, but we also benefits as humans as well. What a powerful force for good. And I forget the figures, I could be wrong here, but I think there are 500 million smallholder farmers worldwide. What a force for good if they realized that destructive behaviors ultimately will destroy our livelihood, and working with nature, we can have a rich and bountiful life. So these are some of the lessons I learned. And then along with that, listen. You know, we have our education, we've got our degrees and PhDs, but let's be humble enough to listen. They may not have been educated, or certainly not all of them, but they're human and they have great power of observation and trial and error and testing. We can learn so much from them. Ask questions. And when I'm trying to convince people to at least try this, I ask a very powerful question. If we continue business as usual, destroying the earth, what does the future hold for our children? And this is a jolting question. And it's in my experience in our workshops, it's the turning point when people start to own this problem as their own and to start to seek solutions. I'm in a bad place. How can I get out of here? Questions are so important. Observe. Most of what I learned, I didn't get from university. I had to observe the actual field situation. And then don't just observe, think about what you've seen. Draw conclusions. Test things, but don't do it in a locked up research plot. Do it with the people. If you do it on your own, those results are your own. If you do it with people, they will own the results every bit as much as you. And you won't have to wait till you've published 10 papers and been recognized and get a major grant. They will do it before the ink's dry on your paper. Learn from the results and adjust what you do. We'll never get it right the first time, be prepared to learn and shift tact along the way. And then finally, we live in an era when we expect everything to be instant. Life very often isn't like that. We need to learn to be patient, to persevere, and to not give up. So these are some of the things I've learned. I won't dwell on climate change. I think we're all well aware of what's happening. We're in a really dangerous period of history. But what can we do with this farmer-managed natural regeneration thing? Could it be part of the solution? It's certainly not the entire solution. We must stop emissions. We must do other things. But when I look at the landscape globally, there are around 3 billion hectares of degraded land, some of which has potential, enormous potential for some or other aspect of this natural regeneration process. 3 billion hectares. Estimates vary, but if we were to restore 1 billion hectare of degraded forest, we could draw down anywhere between 16% and 25% of existing greenhouse gases. And this gives me great hope. If I consider Niger, one of the poorest countries in the world, with minimal external assistance, we didn't have a big budget when we did this. And who were the champions of what happened in Niger? The poorest, the most illiterate, the most risk-averse people on earth. If they can achieve what they did over 20 years, what's wrong with us, with our education and our resources and networking and with appropriate government policies and working with communities bottom up? Surely we can make a big dent on that area, vast area of degraded land, and through that, a big dent on climate change. And so I'm very happy. It's taken a long time, but World Vision itself has set this target to initiate, to catalyze movements that will bring about the restoration of 1 billion hectares of degraded land worldwide. So I hope I haven't spoken for too long, Maria, but thank you for your attention.
No, you have not. It's been amazing to listen to all of these incredible work that you have done. I can tell you there's a lot of engagement in the chat. I will send it over to you, but we can take a few of the comments here. But I also want to mention we started off this course with looking at carbon offsetting and the problems of tree plantations such as eucalyptus plantations. We had on the Mapuche communities in Chile and researchers who have been there, and my students were quite depressed after that session because they thought that everything that has to do with this carbon offsetting and tree plantation is actually a fraud. And so what you have now showed, and I can see it in the comments, is that it doesn't have to be. There are possibilities of doing it in a different way. And before I get into the questions, I wanted to ask you, could you still, like, once again, because it seems that they are like quite thinking that it's been planted, but could you explain explicitly the technique of getting those shrubs alive so that they start growing again, the trees? I think we missed that point.
Certainly. So there's a number of mechanisms. There's dormant seeds already in the ground, or if you alter those behaviors that I mentioned, burning, complete ploughing of the landscape, removal of woody biomass, overgrazing, constant presence of livestock in the same land, if you remove or alter those behaviors, that natural seed bed of dormant seed or seed that's been brought in by the wind, by birds, by animals, it now has the opportunity to germinate and survive. So that's one mechanism. It's through seeds. The other one, and this is more common in developing countries where they haven't used heavy machinery. In Australia, we have bulldozers. We've not only removed the trees, we've removed the stumps. Many countries haven't done that, and the tree stump is still alive and has capacity to resprout. All we've done is gone through and identified with the farmers on agricultural land, which of the species would you like to regrow, how many, and how would you like to manage them? When a tree stump resprouts, it'll have 30, 40, maybe more shoots, all competing for light, moisture, nutrients. So we simply reduce the excess. We cut the smaller, the weaker, the broken ones, and we leave the strongest, tallest, most robust. I recommend to the farmers not to leave only one, because if you only leave one and it grows, immediately it'll be cut. But if you leave 5, you can create a rotation. We'll cut one this year. Next year, they'll be so much taller, and we'll cut a second one. And each year, we're allowing a replacement to regrow. By year 5, you actually have a good-sized tree. If the farmer agrees, and not all are in the position to be able to do this, if they would agree, then we say, instead of cutting that 5th one down, why don't you harvest maybe a third of the branches this year, and then next year, second, third, and so on. And so it's simply the management of the regrowth of what's already there. And what's astounding is what appears as treeless, denuded landscapes across vast areas of the world. In many cases, if there was forest there previously, the remnant is there, but it's underground. You're on mute, Maria, you're on mute.
So what about the water still? Because I've just visited Chile and rivers have dried up. So I don't see how these seeds would be activated if there's no water in the ground.
Well, again, it's this amazing capacity of nature to self-heal, and these are species that are adapted to the climates that they're in. The driest place that I've seen this is in Somaliland, where even I was shocked. They get a 2 inch. Is that, what's 2 inches? How many millimeters?
5 centimeters or something like that. 50 millimeters.
50, 2 to 4 inches, 50 to 100 millimeters of rain. The tree stumps are still alive. And certainly the growth is slower than in a wetter environment, but they're surviving and even thriving. What was I going to say? Even plants growing from seed in that hyper-arid environment, they can grow. It's amazing. And the thing is, you mentioned that the streams have dried. As the vegetation comes back, I've seen in case after case, and I won't say this is going to be universal, but case after case, the water table has been recharged, the springs have been revived, and life comes back to the landscape.
Yes, that is principally the ecological restoration process, right? We get water back into the landscape and then life starts to thrive. A few questions before we go over to Judith. One is here, let's see, I had one interesting here. First, it was about, can companies help to change in this process of change? So we have heard quite a lot of on the critical side of companies cutting down forests or causing destruction. Do you see anything meaningful that can come out of corporations as such? We're at a business school, so the students would like to hear that, but you can openly say what you think.
I primarily work with communities, and I help to protect them from people who would exploit them and their land. But if there was a positive role for companies, and there are many good companies with good ethics, then they could support this process. And I would argue there would be more business for certain types of companies. So what we see as the forest and the environment is restored, people are growing more and different types of crops. So there's more products for sale. Where there was no honey, now with flowering trees, there's a whole new beekeeping industry. Wild harvest of certainly the firewood probably wouldn't be of interest to a company, but some timbers that come back, if you think of that forest in Ethiopia, some of those timbers would be valuable. So for ethical companies, I would say most definitely there's a role. Poor people don't do this because they suddenly become tree huggers. They're hard-nosed people who need to earn a living. If we can link them to ethical markets, it's win-win.
Mm. But then I have another question here, because we have also gone through the problems with certification schemes that promise something and they are not. So there is like an issue of that type. But one is asking here, what will stop companies from buying the restored areas and create profit and then, well, I guess also land grabbing basically and destroy this progress? So communities.
It's a real possibility. So you need to be very careful and very wise, I would say, in working with the authorities and getting legally binding user rights, ownership rights where possible, so that this kind of thing can't happen. In addition, the whole process, I've only given a little window of what we do. We're building the capacity of communities and facilitating their awareness of their rights and helping them to do advocacy in such a way that they won't get imprisoned, but they work with the government. How can we help you, government, to achieve your stated goals? Most governments have biodiversity targets, reforestation targets, climate, and so on. These communities have become very savvy and go to the government and say, we can help you, but you have to protect us.
Okay, so it is working in a way, this governmental then in protecting communities, because very often we hear the other story that it is not.
I will say it can work. It's not universal, and greed is a reality. So you have to be very cunning and you have to persist and work at it, and you won't get it in every situation, but in some situations you get genuine people in government that you can work with.
Yeah, and then here another one is about the hope. We have one student that has been working on development cooperation before, and she says that based on her experience from Nepal, they were told that they shouldn't inspire too much hope in the people because that could actually be a problem, or it could lead to some conflicts. If I say it's a long one, but I try to like shorten it down. What do you see the role of hope? You said that that's the most important, but can it also backfire?
I'd never thought of that before. I guess if it was hope not based on any substance, yes, it probably would. I guess I can talk about hope in this particular case because it does generate hope. People realize I'm not useless, I'm not powerless, I can change my destiny. And even if you tried to stop hope, you can't. It just swells up in people. But I guess there's a point there. So make sure that the services, the innovations you're providing are not baseless.
I think you mentioned in the beginning that your attempt to plant the trees was kind of disastrous in terms of inspiring to hope.
I think people must have been laughing at me because this had been done before with miserable results. And here's yet another one coming out here to try some more.
How much has it spread now? How much do people know? Because I still follow a lot of places through Facebook and other places where they are planting the trees. They're not following the technique that you are using. So communities are not that well aware of it, although they might even be in the same country where you have been. How well has it spread?
Well, one of the reasons why I accept so many invitations to speak is to get the word out. The predominant paradigm globally is still tree planting. And it's a very hard mindset to shift. There's something clean and decisive about tree planting, and you pat yourself on the back. I've done a wonderful job, even if it fails. It's deeply, deeply ingrained, and governments are setting impossible targets. We'll plant 5 million trees in a day, no matter most of them die. And they're trying to beat each other in the record number of trees. It's ridiculous. So, but there's this groundswell. We ran our first international conference in 2012. And the whole auditorium, people were asking, what is this? How does it differ from planting, from agroforestry and so on? There was no knowledge on it. We did the second one 3 years later, and that question wasn't asked again. By the third one in 2018, the donors, the government agents, the researchers, the NGOs, they're all doing it. So it's spreading. It's not universal, but it's spreading, and it's spreading rapidly.
Is there a difference between the kind of carbon capture schemes that you can use? You mentioned that Ethiopia had that. In comparison, if you plant trees versus your techniques? Because there are like ways that they calculate the carbon sequestration.
So,
you know?
so you need, there would be the methodology applicable for natural regeneration, but basically, well, I guess it's, if you plant a monoculture of exotic species, you can extrapolate, everything's going to be uniform. If you're regenerating a biodiverse natural forest, every different ecozone is going to have a different sequestration rate. So, but there is a methodology for this.
Yeah. Good. There are many comments more. We won't have time for them now. I can return to some of them if we have time at the end, when also Judith has made her more general on other topics. I think you will bring in as well. So I will give you now the floor to Judith Schwartz. That is a little bit later in the morning for you now.
Yes.
Thank you, Tony.
Yes, thank you.
I'm a great
we
fan
even
of
have
Judith.
some light now. Thank you so much, Tony. I find this work so extraordinary, and to just reiterate to students the importance of observation and asking questions, because really our solutions, our plans, our work can only be as good as the questions that we ask. So that's something I think a lot about as a journalist. So, just that is incredible. Hello, everybody. I've been exploring efforts to bring damaged ecosystems back to life through my reporting. And in this presentation, I will focus on a few examples that speak to the importance of trees. First, let me introduce you to the Al-Baida project in Saudi Arabia. This is Neil Spackman, and Neil is an American who, as a student, studied Arabic. So he went on and he thought he was going to do translation work. And then he realized that he didn't want to, he couldn't see himself sitting at a desk for his work. So what happened was, there was a project in Saudi Arabia that was a poverty reduction project working to help Bedouin communities who had been pastoralists moving with their herds, and then because of changes in the country and changes of how land ownership was, just actually that there was land ownership, they were no longer able to do that, and they were sedentary, living in concrete buildings, and had become quite poor. So this project, the Al-Baida project, began, and Neil said that he wanted to do this, and he wanted permission to bring in an ecological element, and this was approved. So he had been studying permaculture and natural building on his own, and he did a kind of really fast track permaculture design course with Jeff Lawton of Australia, who famously created a food forest in the Jordanian desert. So Neil got to Saudi Arabia. He developed a team of local people, and they had a plan to restore this extremely hyper-arid, degraded landscape. So what they did is they planned for rain. So Neil knew, and this is something that I think is so wonderful, is that what is a desert? We think that what determines a desert is the amount of rainfall that you get. But how Neil defines a desert is a place where it floods when it rains. Now, it doesn't rain very often there, but when it rains, it does flood. So there was water. So they planned for the water. They built all kinds of, um, you know, just, you know, digging to steer the water. They had water harvesting bunds and berms and all these different ways that they could keep water on the ground and slow it down so that it didn't flood and further erode the landscape. So they, for months, they would work on preparing to harvest water. And then when the rains came, they would rush to plant. And they did this for a while. And one thing is that they never overdrew from their bank of water. They didn't go over their water budget, which is so tempting to do, which is why we, across the world, we have depleted sources of groundwater. So let me show you what happened. Okay, so this is in the very beginning, maybe a year or two. I think they started in 2010, and this might be 2011 or 2012. You can see how there's just a little bit of green where they've slowed the water down. Look at this. That is the same spot in 2019. Now, let me share another picture with you. Now, if you looked at this, I'm not sure that the first thing you would think was that this was a hyper-arid desert. And I want to go back to Neil's definition of a desert, a place where when it rains, it floods. Now, if you look at this, with that grass growing and with the, still the water steering technique that would, the rocks that would slow down the water, I'm not convinced that it would flood. So when it ceases to be a place where when it rains, it floods, it also then ceases to be a desert. Now, granted, this is only 100 acres in a sea of sand, but that suggests the potential of what we can do. And in terms of trees, I want to share this story with you about this. So they planted many, many trees. I happen not to have a photo of the trees, but that's one of the things they did, and they were very careful to plant trees that were native and trees that had economic value. So they followed this routine. They would plant when there was rain, and then they would tend the trees and only use the water for irrigation that they had already collected. In 2016, the project ran out of funds, so they needed to stop the irrigation. And Neil, of course, was frustrated, like, gee, we're doing so well, these trees are growing. But in permaculture, the goal is to have a self-sustaining ecological system. So we will see if that indeed is what we have. So he went back, actually, after 2019 when he took these photos, and after 2.5 years with like so little rain, I think it didn't rain for 2 years, and maybe it was like a few centimeters of rainfall. 80% of the trees survived. So that is extraordinary and tells us that even in the harshest conditions, we collectively, working with communities who are invested in the success of the trees, can grow trees that have all the ecological benefit and all the economic benefit and all the benefit to people's spirits. Now, I will share with you the story of the Los Plateau. I don't know if many have heard this story because it's really kind of like a grand example of ecological restoration. But so the Los Plateau in China was the breadbasket of China. That's where agriculture began some 10, 12,000 years ago, where it also around the same time that it began in the Fertile Crescent. And after, thousands of years of farming, of grazing, of overgrazing, of farming and grazing on hillsides, which was one of the biggest problems, the land degraded and the erosion was tremendous. And it was causing a lot of problems in the Yellow River. So they were getting silting of the river, constant erosion, and people were in dire poverty. People were living in caves. And yeah, you hear stories about the poverty, which were really pretty terrible, really awful and heartbreaking. And the Chinese government said, we can in perpetuity dredge the Yellow River, deal with the crisis at hand, and give charity to these people and give people food so that they could survive, food and shelter. And they said, or maybe if we work to improve the ecology, maybe all of that will come to pass. Anyway, maybe we can solve the problems without having to deal with emergencies constantly. So that was in 1995. And then these photos were taken in 2009, 14 years later. So you can see that this area is green. You can see that they terraced. And another thing that they did is they removed the livestock from vulnerable trees and areas that they were working in, and they penned them and they fed them apart. Now, I've written a book called Cows Save the Planet. So I know, so livestock can be beneficial to the ecology, but it depends on the context. And in this particular, and it also depends on the management. And at this particular context, they needed to take the livestock out of the equation, at least for a period of time. Anyway, the upshot of this is that an area the size of Belgium was returned to ecological function, with trees growing and other plants, and people were able to harvest from the trees. Orchards, there were farmers were proud of what they could do. They had abundance to share, to feed themselves, and to sell at the market. And so about 2 million people were lifted from poverty. So that scale of restoration with trees is just something that we can really own collectively, that it is possible to restore large scale degraded landscapes. So that is a tremendous success story. Another thing I want to share is, I don't know how much in your class you've talked about agroforestry, but agroforestry is it's working with agriculture in the context of reforestation or working with forests. So this fellow is Ernst Goetsch. He is a Swiss farmer who moved to Brazil, and he worked on, he placed a bet with a landowner. The land in the south of Brazil, the land was extremely degraded. As you know, there's been incredible degradation of landscapes in Brazil, including in the Amazon rainforest area with a lot of clear cutting. This was an area that was clear cut and nothing was growing. And the landowner said, okay, Ernst, you've got these ideas. I will give you this land if you give me the yield from the land. So Ernst took up the challenge, and he developed an approach which he called syntropic agroforestry. So syntropy is kind of a made-up word, although it's being used more and more. And it's the opposite of entropy, where energy is dissipated. In syntropy, energy is concentrated. So what you do is you plant trees and other plants strategically and in a very concentrated way. And then you prune these trees and create mulch, use them as mulch. So you're getting more concentrated growing of trees, concentrated biomass, and it's all done very mindfully so that you begin with fast growing trees, and then you also start to put in slower growing, more valuable trees. In this case, it's cacao for chocolate. And as the area becomes more rich in biomass and rich in which becomes soil organic matter, that serves the slower growing trees. And anyway, the project was extremely successful. Syntropic agroforestry is being done in many places throughout Brazil, and Ernst and his team are going around the world teaching this technique. I had the chance to see this in practice when I went to Hawaii, actually in Maui, and there was a project in central Maui where they were doing, they were implementing this. I haven't been in touch with these people. I think it would be worth doing so to see how the project is going. But what I remember is being absolutely surrounded by green. And like you, I live in the north. I live in Vermont in the US, and I just found these plants just so extraordinary. I mean, look at this. This is it's a pineapple, and just being surrounded by pineapples and bananas. Anyway, it's like a banana flower is just so beautiful. It's a bud like, the size of one's hand. It's really quite extraordinary. And just to say that agroforestry is being done here's another example in Hawaii. This was a really interesting variation. This is a man named Koa Hewa Hewa also in central Hawaii. And Koa, he's named for a beautiful native tree. That's a native tree. So he calls his technique polyforestry. And poly means, P-O-L-Y, means, many species, but it also refers to Polynesian, which is where Hawaiians come from and where many of the species come from that are in Hawaii. So polyforestry, he was going kind of a quarter acre by every 3 months, a new quarter acre. And this area that we're seeing, that's 14 months of growth. So these pockets of biodiverse forests are, mixed of different kinds of forest products. They are growing very fast. And what I was going to share is that agroforestry is happening in many places. This is Lori Nickerson, and she's a neighbor of mine. This is about 15 minutes from where I live. And she's doing an agroforestry project with chestnut trees and hazelnut trees. And here's a photo you can see in the background where the trees were recently planted. And this is the landscape where they're starting to grow. They're actually, this is just what the landscape looks like. And the trees were planted in the background. But it's such a beautiful photo of this landscape that is my landscape. I thought I would share that. So I'm moving on to just something else about trees. We understand how many ecological benefits there are of trees, food and other products like maple syrup that we have here in Vermont, shade, wildlife habitat, for fodder for browsing and grazing animals, and embodied water, carbon, and embodied water, and the slowing down of water and the stabilization of soil. I mean, even that is just a fraction of what trees do for us. But there's another dimension that we're learning about, and I don't know whether you all have heard of the term the biotic pump. But the biotic pump is a phenomenon. It's a function of natural forests that has been articulated by a colleague of mine, Anastasia Makarieva from Russia, and her late mentor, Viktor Gorshkov. And what they've determined is that a natural forest acts as a pump. Because there's a lot of transpiration, a lot of movement of moisture, and that when you have a lot of concentrated trees that are transpiring, they are moving moisture up into the lower atmosphere. That creates a low pressure zone, which pulls moisture in, ultimately from the oceans, but the moisture keeps moving across the landscape, and it's the forests that are driving the movement of moisture through, really, around the earth. And this understanding began when Anastasia and Victor posed the question, how do we get moisture? How do we get rains? If the rains originate at the coast from the oceans, how do we get rainfall inland, far inland, like the forest in this picture? So that is just a really important gift that forests do for us. And here you can see this is in the Amazon, and there's another scientist, Antonio Nobre, that we're in touch with. He's from Brazil. He's actually in Sweden now. But this shows you just how much moisture is generated from the trees. There's a quote from Rachel Carson that I love, when she says, "Up there is another ocean," meaning clouds and the mist that comes off of the forest. And this is Anastasia doing some science work, and these particular photos are stills from a really beautiful film that I think is freely available now. A French filmmaker made this film called Rivers Above the Canopy, about the movement of moisture through the atmosphere generated by trees, driven by trees. So that is what I have for you. That's another local friend. And in conclusion, just to share that trees are indeed miracles in the ground, and it's so important to preserve what we have. That, Anastasia and colleagues say, is absolutely the most important thing, is to not cut the native forests. And when planting, you need to create the conditions for them to thrive, which we saw through agroforestry, through the Los Plateau, and in Western Saudi Arabia, that they created the conditions for the moisture to be held in the land so those trees can get a start. And also to stay curious and observant about how trees function in nature, how they're themselves trying to thrive through resprouting, and all of the things that trees are trying to teach us. So that's what I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judith. There are a few comments here for you as well. There were already some coming in before, but let me gather a little bit my thoughts. It's amazing how you can always reframe according to what I'm saying. This year I want to do on trees, and then you have like a perfect presentation on trees as well. So incredible the knowledge you have gathered over and from different parts of the world. That is also, I find so amazing. One thing you mentioned that trees make clouds, right? That's what you were saying. But in your second book on Water in Plain Sight, that's the name, right? You also mention how it influences the patterns of flowing of the water of the rivers above, how they flow, and also that that they not only create but they also attract. I don't know if you mentioned that now. If you would like
That
to a
they
little bit
change
expand.
that it attracts rain. That's what I meant by it pulls the moisture in and to fall as rain. So the concern about the biotic pump is if there is too much natural forest, you know, I say natural forest because the same effect doesn't happen with you know, plantations. Anastasia talks about the wisdom, the knowledge of a mature forest, how what she means by that is the self-regulation that the forests have. Then, so the concern is if too many trees are cut, you lose the function of the biotic pump. It breaks down. And that's what a concern, you know, there's a great concern about that happening in the Amazon.
So here are some comments. Thank you for the presentation. It was relevant for the course to see a concrete example like the approach of Neil. I had never heard of this project. Very interesting. I think many are commenting like that. Here is also a comment on the media's role. Just since you are a journalist, I think that it's kind of interesting to hear this. But it's a little bit long. I will still read it because otherwise I will get lost in the message. I found this quote by John D. Liu in the article on Lost Plateau. I think it's the chapter on that. Extremely interesting. Media didn't seem to want to take responsibility for the outcome of their reporting and what was going on. They were always simply thinking that they were neutral observers and that's all they had to do, that they weren't connected to the consequences. Recently in Finland, there's been discussions about journalism and journalists centering too much on the experience and interest of the middle-class educated readers, which has, it is argued, to an increasing proportion led to news, lifestyle news, and perhaps inadvertently promoting consumption culture. This, of course, feeds into the consumerist mindset that is causing a lot of problems that are both environmental and social. So there's a lack of good news that pass the news threshold, as often these are slow processes rather than these sudden big news. Journalism is called the fourth power for a good reason, but there seems to be a blind spot in journalism. Isn't value-free instrument for delivery, but an activity which takes part in the current environmental disaster we have in our hand. So apart from this self-reflection and critical leadership, how can we address and change this?
That is a huge question, and I can say that I have been feeling, it's been a real challenge to get these stories, for positive news of what's happening in, you know, these stories of what's happening environmentally, for them to get airtime. It's been a real challenge, and absolutely, yeah, I mean, media is part of the system. I mean, it's structured to perpetuate the status quo. Independent media is hugely important. And at this point, I think a lot of people are getting their information away from the media, the conventional media, which has its pluses and then has its minuses because it doesn't have the vetting, the fact checking, the editing function of a well-funded media. So yeah, it's a really complicated question, but I will say, one of the main themes of my book, Water in Plain Sight, is that if we look at how if we look at how the water cycle helps create our climate, if we look at opportunities to work with the water cycle to help bolster nature's cooling processes, then we have so much more to work with than if we look at climate change as only a matter of the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. I got nowhere. I approached major publications and now we're not interested in how the water cycle can help cool the climate, and which just left me flabbergasted. So it's a huge, huge challenge. But the media, and I used to feel that the media led the public, but a colleague of mine pointed out that the media follows. So we can all have an impact by writing letters to the editor, by writing op-eds and opinion pieces, by alerting the media, saying this is what's happening, this is important to follow up on. And yeah, so the media, after a point, the media must follow. I hope that helps.
I'll just give you a comment here that just came in, and then I'll go to another question. But thank you, Judith and Tony, for enlightening presentations. Your passion and innovative approaches like permaculture in challenging environments truly expand our understanding of environmental conservation. Your insights have given us hope and clearer vision for sustainable solutions. And now that I see that Tony is there also, what is your thoughts about media? Has media reported on your innovations, so to say, and what's going on in the sites where you have been working?
Increasingly, you have to work at it though.
Yeah. There is a question about also this making of rains. Judith, not sure if this is your area of knowledge or not, but I was talking with Saudi Arabian friend about the artificial rain that is made in, for example, Dubai, and how every time they make the rain, it floods. Why do you think this is? Does it flood because the draining system there is not proper or made correctly, or maybe trying to do something like this flooding technique that you talked about in the beginning? So these are the technological solutions, kind of more.
Well, about the artificial making of rain, I don't have really anything to say, but my vote would be to work with the natural system. But the thing about rain, and this is something that Alan Savory, who developed holistic planned grazing, holistic management, which is the use of livestock as a vehicle for large-scale land restoration, what he says is it doesn't matter how much rain you get. It matters how much effective rain you have. So the key is to make the rain effective. If they're going to make rain, there is nothing stopping them from doing what Neil Spackman did and creating vehicles for holding the rain. So that is what would make sense, that you would want to be able to keep the rain on the landscape. Tony, do you have anything to say about that?
No, I agree with you, Judith. I'm constantly amazed at the productivity of land which we consider wasteland, desert land, and I've come to the conclusion that many of the areas that we consider as desert are actually altered landscapes. And if you go back in history, there was vegetation adapted to a certain type of climate. We've removed the vegetation, the land has become degraded. Even if the same level of rainfall comes, it evaporates and runs off. And so I'm much more focused on restoring land and not worrying about however much rain you get. It is secondary.
And then there is also the way that trees make rain, because they are also emitting aerosols that become precipitation nuclei, what Antonio Nobre calls like the magic dust or scents of the trees. So you need precipitation nuclei to create rain.
One last question, and if we still have answers, this is to both of you, but if you still have time, I will see if somebody that came in through the other side that are not in the chat want to also raise something. So here is one last question from the students. I will send all of them to you. Environmental rehabilitation so this is a question to both guest lectures. At the end of the chapter of the Reindeer Chronicle, there is a quote: "Environmental rehabilitation is a goal for which every one of us can play a part," he says, and poses the question: how might a shift in priorities towards environmental healing promote human healing on an individual as well as societal level? So the question from the student is, what kinds of initiatives can we do on an individual level today, and what can we do collectively as a society in today's day and age? So what should we do?
Okay, well,
to inspire this healing?
Okay, one is be curious and learn more and see what's going on. Another thing is, acknowledging that there is this gap between the desire to do this work and to contribute and opportunities that are visibly available. And a colleague of mine started an organization called Soil Centric. So it's soilcentric.org. And there's an app that you can say, you can put in what you're interested in. And anyway, there are lots and lots of opportunities. One that are there for internships, for jobs, for volunteer opportunities. And just for one example, that's also something that anyone can look at, is the ecosystem restoration communities that I wrote about in the Reindeer Chronicles that John D. Liu launched with his idea that we should all go camping and restore the earth. So you can look up ecosystem restoration communities.org, and all over the world I think there are 65 projects. So those are just two examples of finding one's way in. Anyway, I'll turn it over to Tony.
Yeah. I guess rather than answering the question for someone, I believe we've all got passions, we've all got interests, and they differ from individual to individual. I do trees. Judith writes wonderfully about all the great things happening around the world, and she affects change in others through her writing. And so discover what your passion is and don't ignore it. Too many of us are duped into the society's treadmill of making money and living mundane lives when we've suppressed this passion that we all have. So follow your passion and do that thing that's inside of you to make changes. I'm not so sure what to say about society, but I believe individuals change society. And look at the thinking of a whole nation changed by Martin Luther King, and there'd be so many examples in history where one person or a small group of people changed what had been normal.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. Very nice. Ending towards the students. Yeah.
Okay, let me add something else, because this is where my book began. Start where you are. Look around. where you live. You know, if you live in a small apartment, you can add, you know, put plants on, and once you start learning from the plants, what they do, how they attract insects, and you know, if you have more land, you can start growing food, and you can watch the changes. You can start having, you know, connecting with other people and have a pollinator corridor. And that's what we're working on here on our land and with other people in the area. So yeah, there's life.
Once you start collaborating with these other species, things kind of show up,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
That is also my experience, and it's very rewarding. Thank you. I'm just